Today, you're about to hear one of the most remarkable political showdowns in recent memory, a moment where calm truth-telling defeated power and spin on live television. Get ready, because this story about Karoline Leavitt isn't just inspiring, it's a reminder that real leadership still exists in Washington. Under the bright glare of the cameras at the National Economic Summit in Washington, D.C., 27-year-old White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt adjusted the microphone in front of her, her every move watched by a skeptical crowd. Across the stage, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, the 84-year-old titan of Democratic politics, smiled with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. This was supposed to be a public takedown? A seasoned political heavyweight effortlessly dismantling a young, inexperienced spokeswoman? News crews, political pundits, and even Pelosi's own aides waited eagerly for what they assumed would be an embarrassing collapse broadcast live to the nation. But what none of them realized, not yet, was that Karoline Leavitt had come prepared. What started as a staged ambush would soon unravel into one of the most shocking political reversals in recent memory. In just a few moments, millions of Americans, especially those who had long suspected that political elites were hiding the real story, would witness something rare: a quiet, unshakable voice standing firm against decades of power and deception. This wasn't just another Washington scuffle. It was a fight for truth, a fight for the working Americans who rarely get to see one of their own push back and win. And it all began with a single folder resting silently on the table before her. Karoline Leavitt's story wasn't born in the marble halls of Washington or the ivy towers of elite universities. Raised in a working-class family in New Hampshire, she grew up understanding the value of a hard day's work and the struggles of everyday Americans. Her rise was fueled not by political dynasty connections, but by relentless effort, fierce intellect, and a deep belief that government should serve the people, not itself. At just 27, she had already shattered expectations, becoming one of the youngest White House press secretaries in modern history. But today she faced her biggest challenge yet, not behind the scenes, but under the blinding national spotlight. Facing her across the summit stage was Nancy Pelosi, a name that for many had become synonymous with establishment politics. With 4 decades of power-brokering experience, designer suits, and a Rolodex filled with Washington's most powerful, Pelosi was the embodiment of the political elite Karoline had vowed to stand against. To the audience, it seemed almost unfair, a political rookie pitted against a grandmaster. Pelosi carried herself with the air of inevitable victory, as if the outcome were predetermined simply by seniority and status. But what the seasoned speaker didn't account for was that Karoline wasn't playing the same old political game. She wasn't there to win points with pundits or play defense. She was there to tell the truth, and for Americans watching at home, tired of polished speeches and broken promises, that made all the difference. It was David versus Goliath in its purest form, and the slingshot was about to be loaded. The summit's opening moments were carefully orchestrated, and they weren't in Karoline's favor. As the moderator introduced the first topic, economic recovery under the current administration, all eyes shifted to Speaker Pelosi. With the poise of someone who had dominated Washington for decades, Pelosi rose from her seat and approached the podium. Aides quickly pulled up a massive digital display behind her, flashing charts, graphs, and ominous statistics meant to paint a grim picture of the economy. Inflation surging, wages stagnant, household savings dwindling. Each data point was carefully selected, designed not to inform, but to overwhelm. Pelosi's voice carried easily across the hall, dripping with confident authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "what you are seeing today is the real story behind this so-called economic miracle. These aren't political opinions, these are facts. Facts the American people live with every day at their kitchen tables." Heads nodded in the audience. Some reporters started typing furiously, already crafting the headlines they thought were inevitable. Pelosi crushes White House narrative. Karoline sat motionless at her table, flipping through a small stack of notes with deliberate calm. Her composure was striking, especially as Pelosi's accusations grew sharper. The speaker didn't just challenge the administration's claims, she ridiculed them. She waved dismissively at one of the administration's touted unemployment figures, calling it statistical smoke and mirrors. She accused the White House of cherry-picking rosy numbers while ignoring the economic hardships facing everyday Americans. And for good measure, she peppered her speech with subtle jabs at Karoline herself, framing her as a naive mouthpiece too young and inexperienced to grasp the complexities of the economy. By the end of Pelosi's 20-minute presentation, the tone in the room had shifted. Cameras zoomed in on Karoline's face, hunting for any sign of nerves. Panelists exchanged glances. Moderators prepared to pivot to Q&A, already anticipating the headline moment when Pelosi would land the final rhetorical blow. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't rattled. As Pelosi returned to her seat, basking in the applause of sympathetic listeners, Karoline simply straightened the blue folder resting quietly before her. The same folder that would soon turn the summit and Washington itself upside down. When the moderator finally turned to Karoline, the weight of the room pressed down like a physical force. Most in the audience expected hesitation, maybe a flustered rebuttal, maybe a retreat into well-worn talking points. Instead, Karoline Leavitt calmly stood, smoothed the front of her navy blazer, and approached the podium with a quiet confidence that immediately changed the air. She didn't raise her voice or throw accusations. She didn't need to. Her strength was in her composure. "Thank you, Madam Speaker," Karoline began, her voice steady and respectful. "And thank you to the summit organizers for allowing this important conversation." There was a pause, a slight, strategic pause, as she placed a thick blue folder neatly onto the podium. Her fingers moved with precision, not nervousness. The audience, sensing something unexpected, leaned in closer. "I believe in facts as strongly as you do," she said, locking eyes with Pelosi across the stage. "And I also believe the American people deserve the full picture." Without another word, Karoline signaled to the technical staff, and a new set of charts appeared on the giant screen behind her. Charts that told a very different story from the one Pelosi had just delivered. Real wage growth adjusted for inflation, manufacturing upturns, inflation rates falling steadily month after month. The data wasn't cherry-picked. It was broad, sourced, and verifiable. Karoline's tone remained respectful, even as she gently but unmistakably began to poke holes in Pelosi's narrative. "I'm not here to debate emotions," she said, turning slightly to address the audience directly. "I'm here to present reality, and sometimes reality doesn't fit the political storylines we're told." For the first time that afternoon, the summit hall grew completely silent, not from boredom, but from anticipation. Karoline hadn't just survived the ambush, she was setting the stage for a battle that no one expected her to win. With a quiet nod to the event technicians, Karoline signaled for the next slide, and in an instant, the summit audience was staring at a series of side-by-side comparisons that no one had anticipated. On the left, the charts Speaker Pelosi had just presented, carefully cropped and narrowly framed. On the right, the full data sets straight from the Federal Reserve and the Congressional Budget Office, clearly labeled and publicly sourced. The contrast was unmistakable. The broader charts showed something Pelosi's presentation had conveniently omitted: wages rising across multiple sectors, inflation falling for 7 consecutive months, and small business optimism reaching a 4-year high. Karoline stepped aside slightly, giving the audience a clear, unobstructed view. She didn't rush her words, she didn't embellish, she simply walked them through the reality. "Here," she said, pointing to a trend line, "you'll see manufacturing output is not declining as previously suggested, but has actually grown by 4.2% annually, something not seen since 2008. She shifted to another graph. "And here is the inflation rate. Yes, we faced spikes early last year, but since then consistent declines, verified by multiple independent agencies, not partisan talking points. Every statement was backed by direct evidence, every number traceable to official public documents. For the first time since the summit had begun, reporters in the press section stopped typing canned narratives and started scribbling notes furiously. A few audience members exchanged surprised looks. Even some of the previously confident moderators sat back in their chairs, watching the unfolding shift. Across the stage, Pelosi's expression hardened. She thumbed quickly through the printed versions of her talking points, realizing too late that Karoline wasn't playing defense. She was rewriting the narrative entirely. Karoline paused, letting the screen speak for themselves. Then she returned her gaze to the audience, not with anger or triumph, but with a quiet, steady sincerity. "I'm not asking anyone here to take my word for it," she said. "I'm simply asking you to look at the complete picture." It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a methodical dismantling, and it was working. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The atmosphere had changed. No longer was this the staged ambush everyone had anticipated. For the first time all afternoon it was clear. The power in the room was shifting. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding her own, she was winning. Just when it seemed Karoline's quiet dismantling of Pelosi's arguments had reached its peak, she paused and calmly lifted a sealed blue folder into view. The room, already humming with nervous energy, fell still. Karoline's voice didn't waver. "Before we move on," she said, addressing both the moderator and the audience, "I'd like to submit one final document for the record, one that may provide further context regarding the economic data we've discussed today." She handed the folder to the summit moderator, who unfolded its contents and froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for the cameras to catch. Karoline continued, her words deliberate and cutting through the air like a scalpel. "This document is an internal communication from the Speaker's own economic advisory team, dated just 2 weeks ago," she said, her blue eyes steady and unflinching. "It outlines a strategy to selectively present economic data in order to, quote, protect the broader messaging narrative." Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Screens flickered to life again, this time displaying the leaked memo itself, complete with the Speaker's office letterhead. Highlighted sections revealed devastating admissions, acknowledgments that manufacturing numbers were in fact improving, inflation was steadily declining, and that these facts were considered politically inconvenient and thus to be omitted from public communications. Karoline didn't gloat, she didn't raise her voice, she simply stood firm, letting the document, the truth, do the speaking for her. "I am not here to question anyone's intentions," she said, giving Pelosi a respectful nod that somehow made the moment even more devastating. "But I am here to ensure that the American people receive the full truth, not a carefully edited version of it." Across the stage, Pelosi's confident smile had vanished. She flipped through her notes with visible tension, her decades of political armor cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. A few members of the summit panel whispered urgently among themselves. The moderator, looking shell-shocked, leaned toward the microphone. "We have confirmed the authenticity of this document," he announced gravely. "It was provided through verified sources." The impact was immediate. News outlets covering the summit live began cutting into their broadcasts with breaking news banners. Conservative media anchors celebrated in real time. Even traditionally liberal outlets couldn't spin away the reality unfolding before them. Karoline closed her folders slowly and addressed the crowd once more. "The American people deserve leaders who tell the whole truth," she said simply, "not just the parts that serve their political ambitions." There was no need for grandstanding, no need for a dramatic flourish. The damage was done. In a single, devastating stroke, Karoline Leavitt had turned the summit, and perhaps the broader political conversation, entirely on its head. And millions of Americans, watching from their living rooms, would never forget what they had just witnessed. The reaction was instantaneous. Within seconds of the memo appearing on the summit's big screens, the once confident atmosphere cracked wide open. Reporters bolted from their seats to file urgent updates. Cameramen swiveled to capture the stunned faces on stage. Across the country, millions of Americans watching live sat forward in their chairs, realizing they weren't witnessing just another political spat. They were witnessing a reckoning. Networks that had prepared to broadcast Pelosi's victory speech were scrambling. Fox News flashed an urgent banner, "Pelosi exposed, internal memo confirms data manipulation." Even CNN, usually cautious in covering administration victories, ran a segment within the hour titled, "Summit Stunner. Press Secretary Turns Tables with Leaked Evidence." On social media, hashtags like Leavitt Truth and Pelosi Memo exploded within minutes, climbing into the top national trending topics. Conservative commentators hailed Karoline Leavitt's performance as the most devastating factual takedown of political spin in a generation. Independent voters and even some traditionally left-leaning voices admitted, begrudgingly, that the exposure of selective data use had seriously damaged public trust. Meanwhile, behind the summit stage, Democratic aides scrambled to coordinate a response. Some senior party officials tried to frame the memo as misinterpreted strategy notes, but the damage was already done. Public trust, once fragile, had been shattered. In closed-door meetings, younger Democratic representatives privately questioned why leadership had gambled so much credibility on a public confrontation they couldn't control. Inside the summit hall, Karoline remained composed. She accepted brief congratulations from sympathetic panelists, but kept her focus professional. There was no fist-pumping, no smugness, just a clear understanding that the moment belonged not to her ego, but to the truth she had stood up for. For many Americans, aged 50 and above, those who had watched decades of political spin and felt ignored by the elites, Karoline's calm exposure of deception wasn't just satisfying, it was vindication. Proof that with enough courage, honesty could still prevail, even against the biggest names in Washington. In the days that followed the summit, Karoline Leavitt's name was everywhere. What had begun as an attempt political ambush had catapulted her into national prominence almost overnight. Her calm dismantling of Pelosi's narrative, and her refusal to gloat afterward, struck a deep chord, especially with older Americans who valued dignity, honesty, and quiet strength over theatrics. Conservative media outlets ran headline after headline praising her composure under pressure. Fox News aired an hour-long special titled "Truth Tellers: How Karoline Leavitt Changed the Game," while talk radio lit up with calls from everyday Americans offering heartfelt thanks. Social media reflected the groundswell too. Karoline's follower count on platforms like Twitter and Facebook soared by hundreds of thousands. More importantly, it wasn't just conservatives rallying behind her. Independents and even disillusioned moderates saw her as a rare figure in modern politics, someone who stood her ground without descending into anger or arrogance. A grandmother from Michigan called into a national radio show, her voice cracking with emotion, saying, "That young lady reminded me what it means to fight for the truth without losing your soul." Political analysts, usually quick to dismiss new faces, began speculating seriously about Karoline's future. Some whispered about a future congressional run, others suggested she might soon become the new face of a rejuvenated conservative movement. Regardless of the exact path ahead, one thing was clear: Karoline Leavitt had done more than survive Washington's fire. She had proven that a new kind of leadership was not only possible, it was desperately needed. The ripple effects of Karoline Leavitt's stand reached far beyond a single afternoon at the summit. Across Washington, the old rules of spin and selective messaging suddenly felt brittle, exposed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. In the weeks that followed, bipartisan calls for economic transparency grew louder. A newly formed caucus, made up of younger representatives from both parties, cited Karoline's summit performance as their inspiration to push for reforms requiring full public disclosure of economic data without political filtering. Even long-time political insiders acknowledged privately that something had shifted. Americans weren't willing to accept carefully packaged half-truths anymore. For older Americans who had lived through decades of broken promises, hollow rhetoric, and media manipulation, Karoline's victory represented something deeper. A return to common sense and plain-spoken honesty. She proved that true leadership isn't measured by seniority or smooth talking, but by a willingness to stand calmly, armed with facts, and refuse to back down when the truth is under attack. Karoline Leavitt's rise wasn't just personal. It symbolized the beginning of a generational change in American politics, where transparency mattered more than titles and courage counted more than connections. As one editorial put it, in an era when many had lost faith, a young woman from New Hampshire reminded America that truth still has a fighting chance. And for millions who had been longing for that kind of leadership, it felt like a long, overdue breath of fresh air. Karoline Leavitt's stunning moment at the National Economic Summit reminds us of a timeless truth. Courage, preparation, and integrity can still triumph over political power plays. In a world where so many have grown cynical about government, media, and leadership, her calm dismantling of a carefully staged attack proved that facts, when fearlessly presented, still have the power to break through noise and manipulation. The lesson is clear. Authenticity matters. It's not about shouting the loudest or throwing the biggest punches. It's about standing firm, knowing your facts, and speaking for the people who deserve honesty, not spin. Karoline showed that youth is not a weakness when paired with preparation, and that respect and composure can often disarm even the most seasoned political veterans. For Americans, especially those who have watched decades of political theater, her story is a reminder that the fight for truth is always worth it, no matter how small you feel compared to the giants you're up against. Integrity isn't old-fashioned, it's the future, and it's exactly what America needs to rebuild trust in its institutions.